There's a photograph that still sits in the basement archives of Mercer County, Pennsylvania. It was taken on the morning of August 14, 1967. In it, 5 children stand barefoot on the porch of a farmhouse that hadn't been opened in 11 years. Their clothes hang loose. Their eyes don't focus on the camera. The youngest, a girl who should have been 4 years old, is holding a doll made from corn husks and what appears to be human hair. Behind them through the doorway, you can just barely make out a word carved into the wooden floor. It says, "Mother." That photograph was never released to the public. The officer who took it requested a transfer 3 weeks later and never spoke about the Ashford case again. Not to journalists, not to his wife, not even, according to his daughter, on his deathbed 50 years later. But the file still exists, and what it contains changes everything you thought you understood about family isolation and what people are capable of when the world stops watching. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The Ashford family disappeared from public record in 1956. Robert and Catherine Ashford, along with their 5 children, simply stopped appearing in town. No one reported them missing because in rural Pennsylvania in the 50s, keeping to yourself wasn't unusual. It was expected. The farm was remote, tucked into a valley where the roads turned to mud every spring and froze solid every winter. Mail carriers stopped delivering after repeated requests from Robert himself, who claimed the family wanted privacy for religious reasons. Neighbors assumed they'd moved. The county assumed someone else was keeping track. And for 11 years, no one checked. No one knocked on that door. No one asked why the Ashford children never came to school, never appeared at church, never walked the 2 miles into town for supplies. It wasn't until a fire broke out in the barn in the summer of '67 that anyone came close enough to realize the family was still there. What the firefighters found that day would haunt Mercer County for generations. And it started with the children. The volunteer firefighters arrived at the Ashford property at approximately 6:43 in the morning. The barn was already fully engulfed, black smoke pouring into a sky that hadn't quite turned light yet. Chief Howard Brennan, who led the response team, later told investigators that his first concern was whether anyone was trapped inside. His second concern came when he saw the farmhouse. Every window had been covered from the inside with what looked like layers of newspaper and cloth. The front door was barred with wooden planks nailed horizontally across the frame. And standing in the overgrown grass between the barn and the house were 5 figures perfectly still, watching the fire burn. Brennan initially thought they were scarecrows. That's what he wrote in his incident report. A detail that somehow makes what happened next even more disturbing. They didn't move. They didn't cry out or run toward the firefighters for help. They just stood there in a line arranged by height, wearing clothes that appeared to be hand-sewn from flour sacks and animal hide. When Brennan approached them, he realized they were children. But something was wrong with the way they looked at him. Their faces showed no fear, no curiosity, no recognition of what was happening. The oldest, a boy who should have been 16, tilted his head slightly and asked Brennan a question that made his blood run cold. "Are you the shepherd?" the boy said. "Mother told us the shepherd would come when it was time." Brennan radioed for police backup immediately. Officer Dennis Clay arrived within 20 minutes, and together they attempted to speak with the children. None of them would answer direct questions. They spoke only in response to certain phrases, as if they'd been trained to recognize specific verbal cues. When asked their names, they remained silent. When asked where their parents were, they pointed toward the house. And when asked if they needed help, the youngest girl, who couldn't have been more than 4 years old, smiled for the first time and whispered, "We've been waiting for the fire. Mother said the fire would make us clean." Officer Clay made the decision to enter the farmhouse. What he found inside would require psychological evaluation for every first responder present. The front room had been converted into what can only be described as a shrine. Photographs covered every wall, but they weren't family photos. They were images of the children at different ages arranged in grids. Each one labeled with a date and a single word: obedience, silence, purity, sacrifice. The furniture had been removed. The floor was marked with symbols drawn in something dark that forensic teams would later identify as a mixture of ash and blood. The kitchen was worse. Officer Clay found evidence that the family had been living almost entirely without modern resources for over a decade. No electricity had been used since 1957 based on utility records. No running water. The hand pump in the yard had rusted solid. Instead, there were dozens of clay jars filled with rainwater, each one marked with careful handwriting that read, "Blessed or sanctified," along with dates spanning years. The food storage consisted primarily of preserved vegetables grown on the property, dried meat of unclear origin, and sacks of grain that showed signs of severe rationing. Investigators would later calculate that the portions allocated per person per day fell well below starvation thresholds. The children had been hungry for years, but it was the sleeping arrangements that revealed the true nature of what had happened in that house. The 5 children had been kept in a single room on the second floor. There were no beds. Instead, wooden boxes had been built into the wall, each one barely large enough for a child to lie down in, arranged vertically like compartments in a morgue. Scratches marked the inside of each box. Deep gouges in the wood where small fingers had clawed during the night. On the wall above them, painted in careful letters 3 feet high, was a message that Officer Clay would see in his nightmares for the rest of his life. The body is a prison. Sleep is practice for death. Mother is the key. The children's parents, Robert and Catherine Ashford, were found in the master bedroom on the first floor. They had been dead for at least 6 days, possibly longer, based on the state of decomposition. The room was locked from the inside. Catherine lay on the bed, her hands folded across her chest, dressed in what appeared to be a ceremonial white gown she had sewn herself. Beside her, on a small table, sat a leather journal filled with hundreds of pages of handwritten text. Robert was slumped in a chair facing the bed, a revolver in his right hand, a single bullet wound to his temple. The positioning suggested he had shot himself while watching his wife die. Though the coroner could not determine Catherine's cause of death immediately, there were no visible wounds, no signs of poison. She had simply stopped living. The journal, which would become the central piece of evidence in understanding what had happened to the Ashford family, was later analyzed by psychologists, religious scholars, and forensic linguists. What they found inside painted a picture of systematic psychological control, religious delusion, and a slow descent into what can only be called domestic captivity, orchestrated by a woman who believed she was saving her children from a corrupt world. Catherine Ashford had not been a prisoner. She had been the architect, and her husband, the document suggested, had been too terrified of her to intervene until it was far too late. The final entry in the journal, dated 6 days before the firefighters arrived, contained only 7 words: "The children are ready. The fire will come." Catherine's journal began in 1954, 2 years before the family withdrew from society completely. The early entries read like those of any rural housewife, documenting daily chores, the children's growth, concerns about money, and the farm's productivity. But somewhere around October of 1955, the tone shifts dramatically. She begins writing about dreams she's having, visions she describes as messages from something she calls the voice beyond the veil. In these dreams, she claims to see the future of her children if they remain exposed to the outside world. She sees them corrupted by television, poisoned by public schools, destroyed by the influence of other children who don't understand purity. The entries become increasingly paranoid, filled with biblical references mixed with ideas that don't appear in any recognized religious text. By January of 1956, Catherine has developed what she calls the protocol. It's a detailed system for removing her family from the contamination of modern society. She writes that she's received instructions on how to remake her children into vessels of light through isolation, discipline, and what she terms the removal of false identity. She stops using their given names in the journal. Instead, she refers to them by numbers 1 through 5. The oldest boy becomes 1. The youngest girl becomes 5. She writes that names are attachments to the old world, and attachments must be severed. Robert appears in the journal rarely, and when he does, Catherine describes him as weak and still infected with doubt. She writes that he cries at night when he thinks she's asleep, that he's asked her multiple times to reconsider, to let the children go to school, to maintain some connection with town. Her response, written in increasingly erratic handwriting, is always the same. He doesn't understand. He can't hear the voice. Only I can hear it. Only I can save them. The protocol itself is chilling in its specificity. Catherine documents every aspect of the children's new lives with scientific precision. Wake time 4:30 in the morning. Morning prayers. 2 hours of recitation. Kneeling on the wooden floor with no cushions. Breakfast. A single bowl of grain porridge. No seasoning, eaten in silence. Education. Catherine teaches them to read using only the Bible and her own journals, which she has begun calling the New Scripture. She writes that conventional education is designed to make children question their parents, question God, question the natural order. She will not allow that poison into her home. The children are taught mathematics only as it applies to measuring ingredients for preservation and calculating biblical numerology. They are taught no history except the history Catherine invents, a narrative in which the outside world has fallen into darkness and only the Ashford family remains pure. The discipline sections of the journal are nearly unreadable. Catherine describes punishments for infractions like speaking without permission, making eye contact without being addressed, or showing emotion inappropriately. The wooden boxes the children slept in weren't just beds. They were sensory deprivation chambers used as punishment for what Catherine called failures of spirit. A child who cried would spend 24 hours in their box with the door closed. A child who questioned a lesson would spend 48 hours. The longest recorded confinement was 6 days inflicted on the oldest boy, one for asking when they would be allowed to leave the property. Catherine writes that she could hear him screaming for the first 2 days, then pleading on the third and fourth, then silence. She describes this silence as breakthrough, as the moment when his false self died and his true self, his pure self, emerged. Psychologists who later reviewed the journal identified this as systematic torture designed to break identity and create complete psychological dependence. When psychologists finally began working with the Ashford children in the weeks following their discovery, they encountered something they had never seen before. In cases of severe isolation and abuse, the children could speak, but they communicated as if language itself was a forbidden tool they had only recently been granted permission to use. They answered questions with long pauses, sometimes waiting minutes before responding, as though checking with an invisible authority for permission. The oldest boy, who investigators eventually identified as Thomas Ashford, age 16, told his assigned psychologist that he remembered his real name, but had not spoken it aloud in 11 years. When asked why, he said simply, "Mother told us that names were chains that connected us to the dying world. We were being reborn as something new, something clean." The middle children, 2 boys and a girl, ranging from ages 8 to 14, provided fragmented accounts of their daily existence that painted a picture of complete psychological control. They described days that blurred together without variation, without holidays, without any acknowledgement of birthdays or seasons beyond what was necessary for agricultural work. They had been taught that the outside world had ended in 1956, that a great catastrophe had destroyed all other families, and that they had survived only because Mother had heard the warning in time. They believed this completely. When shown newspapers and told that other people still existed, that towns and cities were still functioning, the children reacted with confusion and fear. One of them, a boy named Michael, a 12, began sobbing and asking if Mother had lied. The psychologist present noted that this appeared to be the first time the child had ever questioned anything Catherine had told him. The youngest, a girl named Eleanor, who was 4 years old when found, had no memory of life before the protocol. She had been born in 1963, 7 years into the family's isolation, and had never left the property. She had never seen another human being besides her immediate family. When firefighters and police officers arrived that morning, she genuinely believed they were supernatural beings her mother had told her would come to transport the family to the next realm. She had no concept of a world beyond the farm. When taken to the hospital for evaluation, she screamed at the sight of electric lights, having never experienced artificial illumination. She didn't understand cars. She became hysterical when shown her reflection in a mirror, something that had been forbidden in the Ashford home. Catherine had removed all mirrors years earlier, writing in her journal that reflections encourage vanity, and vanity is the door through which demons enter. But the most disturbing testimony came from Thomas, the oldest, who had been 5 years old when the isolation began. He had memories of the before time, fragmented images of attending school, playing with other children, celebrating Christmas with extended family. He remembered his grandmother visiting the farm, bringing cookies and toys. He remembered Robert, his father, being different, laughing sometimes, taking him into town in the truck. And he remembered the change. He described it like a shadow falling over his mother's face, starting slowly and then consuming her completely. He said she stopped sleeping in 1955, that she would spend entire nights sitting at the kitchen table, writing in her journal by candlelight, whispering to herself. He remembered his father arguing with her, his voice rising, her voice staying calm and cold. He remembered the day she announced they would no longer be going to town, that the family would be going to sleep and waking up in a new world, and that they needed to forget everything they knew before. Thomas told his psychologist that he tried to resist at first. He asked questions. He cried. He begged his father to make it stop. But after months in the box, after countless hours of his mother's voice explaining that his suffering was necessary, that pain was the fire that burned away corruption. He stopped resisting. He forgot how to want anything except her approval, and then he said he forgot how to want it all. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? The Ashford case should have made national headlines. 5 children held in captivity by their own mother for 11 years, subjected to psychological torture, starved, isolated, and indoctrinated into believing the world had ended. A father who either participated or was too paralyzed by fear to stop it, who ultimately took his own life rather than face what he'd allowed to happen. It had every element that would typically attract media attention, public outrage, and demands for investigation into how a family could vanish so completely without anyone noticing. But that's not what happened. Within 3 weeks of the children's discovery, Mercer County officials made a decision that still raises questions today. They sealed the case file, the photographs, the journal, the testimony from the children. All of it was classified under a provision typically reserved for cases involving minors and ongoing investigations. But there was no ongoing investigation. Robert and Catherine were dead. There were no accomplices to prosecute, no criminal trial to protect. The decision to seal the records was made according to internal memos that surfaced decades later to protect the community's reputation. Mercer County in 1967 was a place that depended on image. It was rural, religious, proud of its tight-knit communities and family values. The idea that a family could disappear for over a decade, that neighbors could fail to notice, that churches could lose track of their members, that schools could not follow up on children who never enrolled, all of it reflected poorly on the very systems the county held up as proof of its moral foundation. The Ashford case was an embarrassment. Worse, it was a mirror. It forced uncomfortable questions about how many other families might be suffering behind closed doors, how many children might be hidden in plain sight, how many warning signs had been ignored in the name of respecting privacy and minding one's own business. So instead of transparency, the county chose silence. The local newspaper, the Mercer Gazette, ran a single brief story about a fire at an abandoned farm and the discovery of minors in need of services. No names were mentioned. No details were provided. The article was buried on page 7. The 5 Ashford children were placed into foster care separately. County officials decided that keeping them together would prevent them from integrating into normal society, that they needed to be apart in order to heal. This decision, made without input from child psychologists or trauma specialists, would have devastating consequences. Thomas, the oldest, was placed with a family 3 counties away. Within 6 months, he ran away twice, both times trying to return to the farm. On his 3rd attempt, he made it back to the property, which had been sold at auction to a developer. He broke into the remains of the farmhouse and locked himself in the room where the wooden boxes had been. Police found him 2 days later, unconscious from dehydration, curled inside one of the boxes that hadn't yet been demolished. He told the officers who removed him that he felt safe there, that it was the only place that made sense anymore. He was institutionalized shortly after and would spend most of his adult life in and out of psychiatric facilities. The younger children fared only slightly better. Two of them eventually adapted to foster families and went on to live relatively normal lives, though both changed their names legally as adults and refused to discuss their childhood with anyone, including their own spouses and children. The third middle child, Michael, who had asked if mother had lied, never recovered from the psychological fracture of learning. His entire reality had been false. He struggled with paranoia, believing that every authority figure was trying to deceive him the way Catherine had. He died by suicide in 1983 at the age of 28. Eleanor, the youngest, who had been only 4 when discovered, was adopted by a family in Ohio who knew nothing of her background. She grew up believing she had been orphaned in a house here. It wasn't until she was 31 years old, going through adoption records to find medical history information, that she learned the truth. According to a letter she wrote to a journalist years later, the revelation destroyed her sense of identity. She had spent her entire life believing she knew who she was, where she came from, only to discover that her earliest years had been something out of a nightmare she couldn't remember. She wrote that sometimes she wished she had never found out. That ignorance had been a mercy. The Ashford farmhouse was demolished in 1968. The developer who purchased the property claimed he had plans to subdivide the land and build new homes, but construction never began. Workers who were hired to clear the site reported unusual occurrences, tools going missing, strange sounds coming from the woods surrounding the property, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. 3 separate contractors refused to continue work, citing personal reasons they wouldn't elaborate on. Eventually, the developer abandoned the project and sold the land at a loss. It sat empty for decades, slowly being reclaimed by forest until it was purchased by the state in 2004 and converted into protected wetland. No marker exists to indicate what happened there. No historical plaque, no memorial for the children who suffered. The county made sure of that. Catherine Ashford's journal, the most complete record of what happened inside that house, remains sealed in a county archive that requires special permission to access. Researchers who have applied for access report being denied without explanation, or being granted only limited viewing under strict supervision with no photography or copying allowed. The few excerpts that have leaked over the years suggest the journal contains far more disturbing material than has ever been publicly acknowledged. References to rituals Catherine performed on the children, experiments she conducted to test their obedience, and detailed descriptions of what she believed would happen when the final fire came. That last part is particularly haunting given that the barn fire that led to the children's discovery was ruled arson. Investigators determined it had been set deliberately from the inside using accelerants that had been stored and prepared in advance. Catherine had written about fire as a purification tool throughout her journal. The working theory, never officially confirmed, is that she had planned for the entire property to burn with the family inside. A final act of purification that would transport them all to whatever afterlife she had convinced herself awaited. Robert's suicide and Catherine's unexplained death may have disrupted that plan, leaving the children alive to witness the fire she had promised, but not to die in it as she had intended. The question that haunts everyone who learns about the Ashford case is the simplest and the most impossible to answer. How did no one know? 11 years, 4,015 days. The family had friends before the isolation began. Catherine had sisters who lived within 50 miles. Robert had co-workers from his job at the grain mill, a job he quit in 1956 with no explanation. They said they assumed someone else was checking. They said the Ashfords had always been private and privacy was respected in rural communities. They said it wasn't their place to interfere with how another family lived. They said they didn't want to seem nosy or judgmental. One former neighbor interviewed in 1992 said something that captures the uncomfortable truth at the heart of this case. We all knew something felt wrong, but nobody wanted to be the one to say it out loud. Nobody wanted to believe that something that bad could be happening right down the road. The Ashford children, those who survived, are in their 60s and 70s now. Most have never spoken publicly about what happened to them. The few interviews that exist are fragmentary, painful, filled with long silences and careful words. They describe a feeling of being trapped between two worlds, never fully belonging to either. The world Catherine created for them was a nightmare. But it was all they knew, and having it ripped away left them adrift in a reality that felt equally incomprehensible and threatening. Thomas Ashford, who spent decades in psychiatric care, gave one recorded interview before his death in 2009. He was asked what he remembered most about his mother. He was quiet for almost a full minute before answering. She believed she was saving us. He said, "That's the part I can't reconcile. She wasn't trying to hurt us. In her mind, everything she did was love. That's what makes it so much worse. Because how do you heal from someone who destroyed you while believing they were giving you salvation?" The interviewer asked if he ever forgave her. Thomas looked directly into the camera and said, "Forgiveness implies she was capable of understanding what she did wrong. She wasn't. She died believing she was right. So, what exactly am I forgiving?" The file sits in that basement archive still. The photographs, the journal, the testimony, all of it waiting for someone with enough clearance and enough stomach to go through it again. The Ashford case remains one of the most extreme examples of familial captivity and psychological abuse in American history. Yet, it's largely unknown outside of Pennsylvania. The county succeeded in burying it, in protecting its reputation at the expense of truth. But stories like this don't disappear just because they're hidden. They seep into the land, into the collective memory of a place, into the silence that falls when certain roads are mentioned or certain family names come up in conversation. The people of Mercer County know. They've always known. They just decided collectively and quietly that some things are better left in the dark. But you know now too. And maybe that's enough. Maybe bearing witness to what happened to those 5 children, speaking their truth even when their own community wouldn't, is the only justice left to offer. The Ashford family's children were found in 1967. What happened next was a second betrayal, one committed not by their parents, but by every person who chose to look.